So we are really, really lucky to have God's Word. You know, we have this written Word of God's message to us, and we are extremely, extremely fortunate. I think of all the people that don't have it. Growing up overseas, my parents were with Wycliffe Bible translators, and the whole intent was to get the Word into people's languages that they could read it for the first time. And I look at this Word, and I think, how many copies of it do I have? And I didn't count, but I have no doubt that we have at least 30 different Bibles around our house, probably 50 between my wife and I. Bibles that we got when we were kids that were maybe given to us for various things. I have the one that my grandparents gave me when I graduated from high school. Have different versions that I've bought. This Bible was actually given to me by my parents when I started seminary. And we have just all sorts of Bibles. And then even if we don't have a printed Bible, we have our phones, right? And we can have however many versions are out there on our phone or on our app. But then, you know, even with that, there's some parts of the Bible that we don't know very well. There's some books that, you know, we don't have any great quotes coming out of that we think of. So, you know, it's not in the beginning. We all know where that was from. Or love your enemies. These different quotes. And then there's some books, and if I would give you quotes of it, you'd be scratching your head going, I wonder where that's coming from. And one of my goals when I started preaching at different churches was to make sure that I covered the whole Bible. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just focusing on some parts, maybe parts that I like, because God's Word is a whole and a complete thing. And so I've been trying to cover different books, and I know that doesn't help anyone when I'm not at that church all the time, but at least it helps me. And so I've been tracking this, and you know, I think I've in the 90 times or so that I've preached since I started preaching, I think I've covered scriptures in about 44 different books. And in the New Testament, I think it's around 20 different books that I've preached out of. And there's, you know, the ones I haven't in the New Testament are like 2nd Thessalonians and Titus and Philemon, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude. But I was reading through Jude not real long ago, and I was struck by this little book. I mean, it's one chapter. In my Bible, and actually in your pew Bible too, it fits on one page, right before Revelation. This one little book. And as I was reading it, I'm always fascinated when books in the New or the Second Testament reference the First Testament. And as I was reading it, it referenced 3 people in the First Testament. And so that's what we're going to be doing, is going back, and we're going to look at Jude and then go back and look at these men that he mentions. And I thought this would just, you know, be the sermon today. Not going to be, because I got so much stuff on the first one that we're going to cut it off there, or we're going to miss lunch. And so it's probably going to be it's probably going to be a 3-part series. We're probably going to have to spend one day on each one of these men. So in 2 weeks, I'll be back, and we'll do that one. I'm going to call the sermon The Men of Jude, Part 1. And if I ask you, what do you know about Jude, what could you tell me? Or if I read quotes from the Bible, could you identify which ones come from Jude? Like I said, Jude is this little book. It can be read in less than 4 minutes, right? And yet most of us don't know very much about it. Or I'll rephrase that. I don't know a whole lot about it. Maybe you are much more versed in the book of Jude than I am. You know, it's interesting that we're probably more familiar with the song, Hey Jude, at least those of you who are older than 60, right? Because, you know, it was a Beatles hit that was on the top of the charts for 9 weeks, I think. And that song lasted 7 minutes and 11 seconds, I looked up, almost twice as long as it takes to read the book of Jude. And we've probably all heard it many, many more times than we have the book of Jude from our scriptures. And so to dig into Jude just a little bit, starting with the author. The author of Jude was, right, you guessed it, Jude. That's one of those easy ones, right? And Jude describes himself as the brother of James, which is kind of interesting because it's thought that he was actually the brother of Jesus, but in his modesty, he's saying that, well, James is my full brother, and Jesus is my half brother. And so to not take on too much importance, he says, I'm the brother of James, who was also a leader of the early church. And the date and the recipients of this letter are never mentioned, but it's thought to have been written to one particular church. Unlike some of Paul's letters that were written to be passed around to multiple churches, this letter was intended for one audience. And it's thought to have been written sometime after 70 AD. And so, other than the letters or the writings of John, the Gospel of John and his 3 letters and Revelation, this is probably the newest book in our scriptures, other than what John wrote. And the book of Jude, it starts with a real short introduction, and it ends with a short conclusion. And then the main part of the book is 2 sections. Verses 3 through 19 are a warning against false prophets. And then 20 to 23 is this offer of encouragement to preserve. And in the first part, this warning against false prophet, there's 2 sections that are listing out ungodly behavior of false prophets. And then sandwiched right between these 2, verses 5 to 16, is the meat. And so we're going to start this morning with Jude, starting in verse 3. And it says, "Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write, appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. For certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago was designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ." Jude is saying, I wanted to write to you about salvation. I wanted to encourage you about this salvation, but because of what is going on, because of what's going on, I need to write to you to protect your faith. He says, certain people have joined the fellowship, so to speak, the church, essentially, right? The fellowship of believers. Certain people have joined it, and they are perverting God's grace. And so he says to contend for your faith, to contend, to fight for your faith, to defend your faith, to assert it, to claim it, to stand on it, to argue for it, to not be passive, right? He says, be active with your faith and take it seriously, which is a good warning for all of us, that we need to be vigilant, we need to be ever watchful, because the same thing is happening in the greater church today, right? If you pay any attention to what's going on in the greater church, the same thing is happening today. And many people are perverting God's grace and saying that sin is okay, right? And we need to be ever watchful of that. We need to be ever watchful of that. But we also need to continually take a look at ourselves. We need to look at ourselves and say, are we doing the same thing? Are we really living what the Bible says? Or are we morphing it into what we want it to say? And then Jude continues in verse 5. And he says, I want to remind you, although once you fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people in the land, out of the land of Egypt, afterwards destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and their surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desires, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Yet, in a like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. And we like to focus on God's grace. I like to focus on God's grace. And it's so important, but God's grace only makes sense in view of God's judgment. We can't talk about his grace without talking about his judgment, because if there is no judgment, there's no need for grace. Right? If there's no judgment, why do we need grace? And Jude is showing examples of that. He's saying God is so loving. God is so patient. But there's a limit. There's a limit, and the judgment will come. And he loved and he cared for the Israelites in Egypt. And he brought them out of Egypt. But then in the end, there were those that didn't believe in him, that didn't listen to him, that didn't submit to him, and he destroyed him. And the same with Sodom and Gomorrah. He destroyed them because they wouldn't listen, because they wouldn't honor him. And then jumping down to verse 11, it says, "Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's heir and perished in Korah's rebellion. These are hidden reefs at your love feasts, as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept along by the wind, fruitless trees in late autumn, dead twice, uprooted, wild waves of the sea casting up their foam of their own shame, wandering stars for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever." Jude is warning that there are people who are among this church, who are hidden in plain sight, you could say, who are like reefs that are going to wreck the church, right? Everyone in the church should have a purpose, and these people are not doing their purpose. They're like shepherds that are feeding themselves. Instead of taking care of the flocks, they're taking care of themselves. They're like clouds that are supposed to bring rain that never do. Trees are supposed to produce fruit. They're saying, these trees are dead. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But then as I was reading this, what really caught my attention was the three names: Cain and Balaam and Korah. And I thought, of all the people mentioned in the First Testament, all the people mentioned for their faults, why these three? Why did he pick these three? And what can we learn from them? And Jude, he obviously thought that his readers were knowledgeable of them, or he would have given details, right? He wouldn't have just given their names. And the original readers of this letter, they may have been more knowledgeable than we are. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend the rest of our time today, and probably the next 2 times that I come here, we'll see how that goes, digging into these three people and seeing what we can learn. So we're going to start with Cain. And Cain is mentioned just in passing in 2 other places in the Second Testament, but the only place in the First Testament is in the book of Genesis. So we're going to go from the next to last book, flip all the way around to Genesis chapter 4. We're going to talk about going from one extreme to the other. Genesis chapter 4, and I've also got it on the screen here, and we're going to read the account of Cain. And it says, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flocks, and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will it not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel, your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. The Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So Cain has some very unique distinctions, multiple things that he was first with, right? Cain was the first baby born on the earth, right? He was the first joy. Can you imagine the joy that his parents had? I mean, all of us, when we have our first child, are pretty excited. But this was the first one, period, right? Adam and Eve, they'd probably seen other animals having babies. They'd seen rabbits having babies. They'd seen puppies and other. Now they had their own child. And Eve even says, she goes, with God's help, I've created another man. They were all excited. Up until that point, the only person that Adam and Eve had to talk to was each other. How would that be for your marriages? Sometimes it's nice to have someone else, isn't it? They finally did. First there were 2, then there were 3, and then there were 4 because they had another child. They had Abel. And then Cain becomes a farmer, a worker of the ground, and Abel a shepherd. And so if we would just stop the story there with what we know, we would actually think that Cain was doing what he was supposed to be doing, that he was doing God's will. Because if we go back to Genesis 2, God had Adam and Eve in the garden, and he commanded him to work it and keep it. He didn't tell him to take care of the animals. The animals could take care of themselves. God told Adam to care for the garden. And a chapter later, after the fall, in Genesis 3, 17 and 19, as the curse, God is saying, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall bring it forth, and you shall eat the plants of the fields. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground out of which you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you will return. God's saying, the intent here is for you to be a farmer, but you're going to have to work at it, and you're going to have to work harder now than what I intended. And farming is not easy, right? I mean, that hasn't changed. Any farmers here? Farming is not easy. But if you want to eat, is what you have to do. And farmers still feed the world, right? Without farmers, we wouldn't have much to eat. So Cain was a farmer. He was a worker of the ground. And Cain, he brought this offering to the Lord from his crops. And his younger brother Abel also brought an offering from his flocks. And we don't know a whole lot about these offerings, but we do know that Abel's offering from the flocks was pleasing and accepted by God, and Cain's, his offering, was rejected. So why? Why was the one offering accepted and one rejected? We're not told directly. Some theologians think that there was a motive that Cain had that was only known to God. That there was something that's not recorded for us that made that offering not accepted. And it could be because doing the right thing for the wrong reason doesn't make it right. Right? Doing the right thing for the wrong reason doesn't make it right. And Hebrews tells us that by faith, Abel offered a sacrifice that was more acceptable than Cain's. So maybe Cain's faith was wrong. Maybe he wasn't presenting it right. Maybe he resented what he was doing, and he was doing it just because he thought he had to, because he had worked hard for those crops, right? It was by the sweat of his brow. Maybe he resented how hard he had to work. And it's possible that the reason his offering wasn't accepted was because of his heart. But many theologians take a clue from the sacrifices themselves, because there's a difference in these two sacrifices, other than that one was from the flocks and one was from the fields. There's a difference in what Cain and Abel brought as offerings. Because if we go back here, it says that Cain brought the fruit of the ground, but Abel brought the firstborn of his flocks and their fat portions. See, you notice the difference? Not the difference of the fruit and the flock, but Abel, he brought the firstborn. He brought the fat portions. The first and the best is what he brought. And it doesn't say that about Cain. It just says Cain brought some of his produce, some of the fruit of the land. And many scholars believe that's why his offering wasn't accepted, because he didn't bring the first and the best. And when God rejected this offering, Cain was angry. He was angry because his heart wasn't right through this whole thing. And maybe that's why his offering wasn't accepted. But it's my guess is, I can't prove this, it's my guess that he knew his offering wasn't right. And he was being called out on it. He was caught doing what he knew he shouldn't be doing. I know for myself, if I'm doing something that I'm not supposed to do, but I'm not aware of it, and I get caught, it's not a big deal. If I'm walking across the grass and someone says, hey, you're not supposed to be out there. Don't you see that sign that says keep off the grass? I say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, and I get off the grass, right? But if I see the sign and I say, I'm going from there to there, and I don't care what that sign says, grass is made to walk on, and I'm going to walk on it. And I walk across, and someone says, hey, you're not supposed to be on the grass. I'm like, mind your own business. I'm going to do what I want to do, right? And I get defensive, and I get angry, and I resent it, and I make excuses, and I lash out. And I'm wondering if Cain was the same, if Cain knew what he was supposed to be doing and didn't. And then it's interesting because God talks to Cain. This is the first of two recorded conversations between the two of them. And God calls out Cain, not on his offering, interestingly enough, but on his anger. Isn't that interesting? God tells him, hey, essentially, you knew what was right, and if you did it, you would be accepted. Why are you angry? You knew, do it. And then God warns that sin is trying to get into his life. I think of sin as being a little bit like my dog. I have a black lab. She's about 70 pounds, and she's an outside dog most of the time. She's allowed in sometimes, but she sleeps outside. She has a doghouse. God gave her a fur coat. I figure God gave her a fur coat, she can sleep outside, right? So she's outside. But on the super cold nights in the winter, when it's rainy or snow or even blowing, she wants in. And if we just crack that door for something, there's 70 pounds of force that are barging into the house, bolting across the room and curling up in the corner, right? That's sin. That's sin. Sin wants into our lives. And it's looking for that opportunity. It's looking for the door to be cracked open. And give it just crack the door. Just unlatch it. Don't even open it. And sin will barge in. That's what God is telling Cain. And so after being warned about his anger, after God warned Cain about his anger, Cain takes Abel out in the field and he kills him. The firstborn child of the world kills the secondborn. And why? Why? Because he was angry. He was angry really at God. I mean, it resulted from his brother, but he was really angry at God for not accepting his offering. And his anger flared as a result of this divine rejection, and he took it out on somebody else. Anybody else like that? You get angry about something. Maybe it's something that's your own fault, and you take it out on someone else. You come home and you kick the dog who didn't do anything but come out to greet you. Hopefully, I'm not the only one that does that. Actually, hopefully I am the only one that does that, and the rest of you don't have that issue. But sometimes we get angry about something and you take it out on someone that didn't have anything to do with it. And then the spiral continues. It started with this unacceptable sacrifice, right? And that led to anger when it wasn't accepted. And anger led to murder. And murder led to a lie. Because God, again, he talks to Cain. And Cain doubles down. God asked him, where's Abel? And Cain's like, I don't know. Which honestly blows my mind. It blows my mind. Because all of Cain's life, I would think that he had heard stories from his parents. Stories of creation. Stories of how God took a rib out of his father to make his mother. Right? Stories of how they had named all the animals. You know, Cain could have said, why did you call it that? And Adam and Eve could, well, it was this. And, I had these conversations and stories about the fall. and stories about walking in the evenings with God. What was that like? In the cool of the evening, to walk and talk with God. He would have heard these stories. In fact, he may have even seen the Garden of Eden from a distance. Can you imagine going with your parents to where they had been kicked out and saying, yeah, it's over there. And there's that cherubim with a flaming sword that's guarding the tree of life, that's guarding it so we can't get back in. That's where we were. That was paradise. Cain could have seen these things. First-hand experience with the first people on earth. But he obviously didn't have the right relationship with God. He didn't have the right view of God because he outright lies to him. And God again calls him on it and tells him that now the ground he's going to be cursed from the ground. Some translations say he's going to be alienated from the ground. The ground would no longer yield its produce for him. He would be a fugitive and a wanderer and vanish from cultivated areas. And at this point, Cain cries out and says, oh no, that's more than I can take, God. That's too much punishment for me. Which is also kind of fascinating to me because there's no record of his parents when they sinned in the garden of complaining about their punishment. When God said, you're going to be kicked out of the garden, they're like, no, we like it here. Don't do that to us. There's no record of the serpent when God says, you're going to crawl in the dust on your belly saying, oh, not my belly, God. At least give me short legs. Let me be like a lizard. No, there's no record of that. But for some reason, Cain thinks that he can choose his punishment, which again, it shows this huge misunderstanding of who God is and how holy he is. And Cain is worried for his life, right? Kind of interesting that Cain took the life of his innocent brother, and then he's worried about somebody taking his life. And maybe when he killed his brother, he saw something. I mean, this would have been close quarters, right? A rock beating on his head, his foot stepping on his neck. Maybe Cain saw the pain and says, man, I don't want to go through that. But it's kind of interesting when he was saying that somebody's going to kill me. Who? His parents or his siblings? Right? That's all there was. Cain's worried for his life, and the only other people on the earth were his parents and his siblings. But he's concerned about his life, and so God marked him to protect him from revenge. But then in verse 16, I find this the saddest thing. It says, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. Cain walked away from the presence of the Lord. We all have that choice. We all have that choice. We can decide what we want to do. Cain decided that he didn't want to live under God. He didn't want to submit to his authority. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. And so he left. And he took his wife with him. He left the presence of the Lord. And this, I think, is what Jude is warning us about. Those in the church who don't want to be under God's authority and who are taking others with them. Because Cain is one of the few people that had this direct conversation with God. Right? He heard firsthand accounts of the garden, firsthand accounts of walking and talking with God. He should have had more knowledge of God than any of us. And yet, he chose to walk away from the presence of the Lord. And his wife must have been a sister, went with him. So back to where we started this morning, back to Jude. Jude was warning the church of ungodly people who would join and perverted the grace and denied Jesus Christ. Jude said that they walk in the way of Cain and Balaam and Korah. So what was Cain's way? What have we looked at today? Cain had a misconstrued view of God. Right? He didn't acknowledge God's holiness. He didn't take his best. He didn't take his first fruits to God. He went through the motions without having his heart right. And he let his anger get the best of him. He took it out on someone else, his brother, and then he lied to God. And then after all of this, he decided to leave God's presence. That is the way of Cain. And Jude warns the church that those are there. There are people in the church who are baseless, who are like reefs who are going to shipwreck the church because of their beliefs, because of being like Cain. They're like clouds that don't bring rain. They're like trees that don't bring fruit. They're like shepherds who are more concerned with themselves than with their flocks. People are always welcome to the church, but we all have to be working to glorify God, right? And with any warning like this, we need to be on the lookout for these characteristics. But we also need to do an honest evaluation of our own lives. What is our view of God? Are we giving him the very best effort, the first fruits of our lives? And when God disciplines us, do we get angry and make excuses? Or do we tremble before him and ask for forgiveness? Do we really want to be in his presence? Or do we want to get away from it? And so this morning I encourage everyone to take a look at your own life, an honest look. Cain could have said, I offered a sacrifice, because he did, but his heart wasn't right. So let's make sure our hearts are right. And in the end, Cain decided to leave the presence of God. So I invite you and encourage you, welcome you to come back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks we're going to do part 2 and look at Balaam and see what we can learn from him. Until then, I encourage you to keep seeking him, seek to be closer, seek to be in his presence, not farther from God. Thank you.